welcome. I'm Kriti Mehta and you're watching World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a quick check of the headlines this hour. European Union chief Kaja Kallas says Europe must ensure Russia never attacks again, insisting any peace deal must focus on Russian obligations and include meaningful concessions from Moscow to secure lasting stability. Sweden's foreign minister says she would welcome tougher US sanctions on Russia and urges the European Union to move immediately on a 20th sanctions package to increase pressure on Moscow. Poland will receive about $50 billion from the European Union's SAFE program to boost defense. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk says the funds will support drones, AI, military equipment, border security, and ballistic operations. The Trump administration and Belarus discussed the possible release of at least 100 political prisoners as Minsk continues gradual detainee releases in a growing effort to improve ties with Washington. Gaza's health ministry says that Israel returns the bodies of 15 Palestinian prisoners on 26 November under the US-brokered ceasefire exchange deal. Israel confirms the identity of the hostage body returned by Hamas on Tuesday. The hostage has been identified as Dror Or. With the latest handover of Or's remains, it leaves 2 more hostages still held in the territory. At least 13 people have been killed in a major fire that has engulfed a residential building in Hong Kong's northern Tai Po district. Several people are still trapped under the debris. China warned it will crush all foreign interference over Taiwan after Japan announced plans to deploy missiles near the island, as Beijing reasserted its claim over Taiwan and criticized Japan's move. And viewers, Sweden's foreign minister has called for increased pressure on Russia, urging the United States to impose additional sanctions. He's also emphasized that the European Union must act swiftly to implement a 20th negotiation sanctions package to intensify the pressure on Moscow. Meanwhile, European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's advisor Kaja Kallas warned that any peace agreement with Russia must ensure the country will never launch another attack. Kallas stressed that the focus of any deal should be on Russian actions and said that meaningful concessions from Russia must be included in any peace agreement. These statements highlight ongoing European Union efforts to hold Russia accountable as diplomatic efforts for a settlement continue. Listen in to what the Swedish Foreign Minister Maria Malmer had to say.
Vi vill också att EU går vidare i arbetet med ett 20:e sanktionspaket omedelbart för att öka pressen på Ryssland. Ett 20:e sanktionspaket måste slå ännu hårdare mot ryska energiintäkter som är den främsta finansieringskällan för kriget. Precis som USA har annonserat så behöver EU också gå efter de ryska oljejättarna som Rosneft och Lukoil. Och vi behöver också se till att fler av EUs sanktionslistningar av fartyg i den ryska skuggflottan överlappar med andra partners som USA, Kanada och Storbritannien för att minska kryphålen.
And Mohammed Osman, who's an international relations expert, is joining us live from Cairo. Very warm welcome to you, Mohammed Osman, and thanks for joining us here at NewsX World. Now, with the increasing pressure of the United States on the US to ask for tougher sanctions on Russia, we have now more and more countries pressuring the United States, whether it's Germany, whether it's Sweden or the United Kingdom, even though it's not in Europe anymore. But there is pressure that's mounting on the US. Do you think it's going to have any expected outcome, especially now when we know that Witkoff has been sent off for a visit next week to Moscow?
Thank you for having me, and greetings to you and to your audience. It seems that the bigger question should be whether sanctions are viable to begin with. It's been 3.5 years since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Russia has been subjected to an unprecedented amount of sanctions, over 10 to 15,000 sanctions, if I'm not mistaken. And yet Russia has persevered, its economy did not collapse, and it's actually advancing in Ukraine and pursuing its war aims, and is basically closer to success in the Ukrainian war than ever before since the beginning of this war back in 2022. So I think that the idea that that the Europeans are pushing for more and more sanctions, Marco Rubio himself, the Secretary of State, said that we have thrown everything at them basically in terms of sanctions and tariffs and whatnot, and yet it did not yield any results. So this is the American position. The United States is more interested in trying to pursue a de-escalation of the conflict in Ukraine and finding a pathway for a realistic settlement rather than actually pursue any more escalatory measures. And this is where the sharp disagreement between the Americans and the Europeans comes in, basically, because the Europeans see that that the framework of the settlement that is being proposed right now by the United States and discussed with the Europeans and the Ukrainians does not satisfy the security needs and the security concerns of the Europeans, let alone the Ukrainians, of course. But of course, at the same time, what the United States is proposing is basically reflective of the situation on the ground. Russia is winning. Russia is advancing on all fronts. Russia has captured Pokrovsk, has captured Kupiansk. They are about to capture Mirnograd and other cities. They are advancing in Zaporozhye. Ukraine is suffering from a shortage of manpower. Foreign aid to Ukraine, whether military or economic, has dwindled by about 50% or 46% in the year 2025. The US is not giving as much support as it used to do anymore. Europe does not have the stockpiles or even the industrial infrastructure to produce the amount of weapons and ammunition needed for the Ukrainians. And even if they confiscate the hundreds of billions of dollars of frozen Russian assets, it will still be not enough to satisfy Ukraine's needs, which is estimated at around $450 billion in whether economic aid or military aid, in order for them to actually persevere and not collapse before the Russian attacks. So it's an arithmetic issue, basically, as you can see.
But do you think that the United States is lacking a comprehensive strategy as far as Russia is concerned?
No, I think the US has a coherent plan, and this plan is very biased towards the Russians, it seems. It doesn't seem that the United States, or the Trump administration rather, or President Trump himself and a few of his close associates like Steve Witkoff and J.D. Vance and others, they are not interested in engaging in a proxy war against Russia anymore. However, there are, and therefore the 28-point plan that has been proposed basically gives Russia what it wants: Ukrainian neutrality, downsizing of the Ukrainian army. Russia gets to keep the lands it acquired, and also it gets to take over the rest of the Donbass. About 15% of the Donbass is still controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces. And of course, the sanctions will be lifted and so on and so forth. So this is what the Americans are proposing. On the other hand, they are giving security guarantees to the Ukrainians. They are not as strong as the Article 5 provisions of the NATO Charter. However, at the end of the day, they are security guarantees that will deter future Russian aggression, which makes what Kaja Kallas said the other day, basically about the Trump plan, inaccurate, because it does provide that guarantee to the Ukrainians. So I think that the Trump administration does have a coherent strategy with regards to the resolving the conflict in Ukraine. However, there are components within the current U.S. administration and the U.S. deep state and U.S. Congress who are vehemently opposed to what President Trump is doing, and they are attempting to sabotage his attempts to reach a ceasefire and a peace settlement in the Ukraine war. They are pushing for more escalation. They are pushing for the U.S. to revise its current plan to remove provisions with regards to Ukrainian neutrality and non-accession to NATO, and so on and so forth, which was basically ensure that Russia will refuse such a proposal if it is amended along such lines. So as you can see, the situation is very complicated at this point. However, I do believe that so far the Trump administration is very interested in pursuing the course of action of settling the Russia-Ukraine based on the actual variables on the ground. And Steve Witkoff is visiting Moscow next week and will meet with President Putin. And the Ukrainians are being more flexible from the reports we hear, because basically, as President Zelensky said, we have a choice either to continue and lose a valuable ally, which means Ukraine basically losing this war if they lose the support of the United States, or basically to lose, as he said, our national dignity, what President Zelensky said, which means that they will have to make very tough choices.
But Mr. Osman, there's also the question of the new arms treaty, given that the present one is set to expire in February next year. How is the U.S. going to address that?
Well, the thing is, the Russians have been very eager to actually extend the New START treaty by a year, so that there will be any arms, because it's the only remaining arms control regime between the United States and Russia that is still in force. That Russia is interested in extending it. President Trump clearly has another vision that includes a trilateral mechanism that involves Russia, China, and the United States, something that China opposes, and Russia is eager to keep that bilateral mechanism intact. However, the Trump plan does say that one of the provisions is that there will the issue of nuclear arms control will be addressed bilaterally between the United States and Russia. So if the war in Ukraine is resolved, I do not see a reason why they will not find a pathway in order to find common understandings, either to extend this treaty or to even come up with and promulgate new treaties or agreements. However, if the settlement, if the peace efforts in Ukraine hit a brick wall or a dead end, and by the way, this is very possible and very plausible actually, given the current circumstances, I think that no common understandings will be reached and the treaty will expire, and this will have very dire consequences, especially that the United States and Russia have both expressed their intention to resume nuclear tests, which basically pushes the world into a whole new territory that is plagued by so many dangers that we thought were left behind after the end of the Cold War.
Sure, but with continuous bombardments from the Russian side on Ukraine, do you think Russia is likely to accept the peace plan? Is it a way of it, in fact, rejecting the peace proposal?
I think that any arrangement that will secure for Russia Ukrainian neutrality, the partial demilitarization of Ukraine, also the departure of President Zelensky from office, and this is provided by the U.S. initiative saying that presidential elections will be held within 100 days, and also that Russia gets to secure or maintain the territories it captured as they are in Kherson and Zaporozhye, and the entirety of the Donbass, along with Crimea, of course. If there is an agreement that provides Russia with these concessions or with these provisions, I think that the Russians would agree to it. Even the confiscation of Russian assets or part of them in order to use them in the reconstruction efforts in Ukraine, this is something that Russia is open to. The gradual lifting of sanctions, this is something that Russia is also willing to accept. However, and even the security guarantees that Ukraine is about to receive, including a provision that clearly states that Ukraine, if Ukraine is subjected to another invasion or attack from Russia, all sanctions will be reinstated and a coordinated military response will be carried out by NATO countries. So this is a very, very strong provision that Russia is willing to accept, in my opinion, if it is given the other concessions. So if the plan remains unchanged in the core issues in it, I think that the Russians will probably accept it, especially that they were included in coming up with this plan. There were consultations between Steve Witkoff and several Russian officials during the promulgation and the formulation of this peace plan since October, according to reports. And the Ukrainians were also included in the conversation, but the reports suggest that the Russians were consulted much more vociferously than the Ukrainians were.
Well, thanks, Mr. Osman, for joining us and sharing your opinions with us here at NewsX World. And with that, viewers, we will now shift our focus to news from the United Kingdom. Now, Britain's fiscal watchdog has apologized for publishing details of UK's Finance Minister Rachel Reeves' budget, which is an unprecedented error that stole the Finance Minister's chance to reset a growing narrative of incompetence in dealing with a struggling economy. The error sparked anger and mockery in the House of Commons and a frenzy on trading floor. The Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the OBR, meant the key announcement from the budget on taxes, economic growth and individual policy changes, and were all reported an hour before Reeves stood up to deliver her budget to Parliament. Let's listen in to what Rachel Reeves had to say.
Today's budget builds on the choices that we have made since July last year. To cut NHS waiting lists, to cut the cost of living, and to cut debt and borrowing. No doubt we will face opposition again, but I have yet to see a credible or a fairer alternative plan for working.
All right, and Peter Cardillo, who is the chief market economist of Spartan Capital Securities, is joining us live from New York. Extend you a very warm welcome. I just want to begin by asking you a very broad question, which is to basically explain the new budget that's been put out and the criticism that it's receiving, especially as far as the wealth tax is concerned.
Yeah, obviously, excuse me. Obviously, you know, the finance minister unveiled the budget, and it's somewhat of a questionable one, I think. $26 billion in new taxes, and probably opens the path for lower interest rates. So I think, you know, this budget doesn't do anything to change the credibility gap that the United Kingdom has. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the British bond market and, of course, other markets respond to this. You know, there was a blunder to begin with. The OBR released the data, the budget, before the finance minister presented it to Parliament. And as a result of that, the CEO of the OBR has resigned or is resigning. And so it was a calamity, so to speak. And again, I'm not sure what the real outcome. I just think that it does nothing to close the credibility gap.
Right. In fact, one of the very severe consequences that we are seeing is how high net worth individuals are planning to flee the United Kingdom. We just saw reports of Lakshmi Mittal planning to move to Dubai. What's likely going to happen in the future?
Well, I'm not sure what could happen in the future, but let's talk about what might happen with the British pound. I think that, you know, initially it's probably going to give it a boost. In fact, as I look at some of the trades right now, it's basically up against the U.S. dollar. But I think as we go forward, it's going to be negative. I think we could see the British pound drop under 130 in the coming weeks or in the coming months.
All right, and who do you think, which section is this budget really going to be helping?
Did you say recession? Did I get that right?
No, which section is the budget? Which class of people is this budget really targeted towards?
Oh, well, again, you know, anytime you raise taxes, obviously that's going to affect spending. That's going to hold back companies from spending. And that means less growth. And so I think that's the key. Raising taxes is not the way to go. Unless you accompany that by incentives for the consumers or for businesses in general. But I did not see any of that in this budget.
And what about the retirees and the long-term homeowners? How is this budget going to impact them?
Well, again, it probably means higher interest rates, so that's a negative in terms of real estate in the United Kingdom.
All right. Well, thank you for now joining us here, Peter, and sharing your perspective with us. And viewers, let's shift our focus. Now, the European Parliament has approved a resolution proposing a default minimum age of 16 for accessing social media, aiming to protect adolescents from the mental health risks linked to excessive online exposure. Now, the legislation also calls for a harmonized digital age limit of 13 for video sharing services and AI companies. Social media giants like TikTok, Facebook, and Google have faced scrutiny over their role in fueling a mental health crisis among young users. Additionally, the resolution proposes a ban on loot boxes, which allow minors to buy or win virtual items with real money, and calls for age-appropriate content on these platforms. Now, though the resolution is not legally binding, it signals the European Union's growing focus on children's digital safety and mental well-being. Meanwhile, citizens in Paris have spoken out against the move. Let's listen in.
C'est un point positif comme négatif. Positif du sens où on leur inculque pas directement l'envie et des idées trop néfastes que les réseaux sociaux peuvent donner. Mais d'un côté, le fait de leur autoriser les réseaux sociaux, ça leur permet un peu de déjà savoir de eux-mêmes, d'apprendre d'eux-mêmes sur ce qu'il faut faire et ce qu'il ne faut pas faire et comment utiliser les réseaux sociaux. Et je pense qu'il est primordial aussi d'assister ces jeunes de moins de 16 ans sur les réseaux sociaux.
Enfin, moi, c'est un moyen de communication et j'ai des copains, moi, qui n'avaient pas les réseaux sociaux et pour eux, c'était un peu prenant de ne pas avoir les réseaux sociaux parce qu'il y a ce truc de tout le monde suit tout le monde et voilà. Après, je sais que moi, j'aimerais beaucoup diminuer cette consommation des réseaux sociaux parce que c'est facile. Maintenant, les contenus sont très petits et rapides. Mais je pense que ça doit être... En fait, c'est la violence sur les réseaux sociaux, tout ce qui est guerre, etc., qui doit vraiment être expliqué et dire que c'est des images violentes et qui doivent pas être en accès pour tout le monde, je pense.
All right, and John Rossomander, who's president of Viking Research Associates and geopolitical analyst, is joining us live from Washington. Thank you, Mr. Rossomander, for joining us here at NewsX World. And now, how do you see this move being taken by the European Union? Of course, we know how earlier Australia had also implemented a similar measure. Is this a step in the right direction?
Well, it's definitely a step in the right direction because adolescents are very impressionable and they take in what they see on social media as the truth. When, really what the social media is somebody trying to manipulate them and they're not, wise enough. I mean, when you're an adolescent, your brain is still developing. So, patterns that you pick up in adolescence stay with you for the rest of your life.
But how is this measure going to be enforced? Will it strictly be adhered to? Are there not going to be loopholes that the adolescents are going to come up with and continue their use of social media?
I mean, there's no doubt that, adolescents are smart. They'll figure out ways of getting around it, impersonation, and so forth. I mean, that's the oldest, teenage measure in the book. However, if they can come up with, verification or like passcodes that maybe parents get on their phones or something like that that are required to access social media, then it might become more challenging. But never underestimate the resourcefulness of a teenager.
And there is also an increasing reliance on social media for the adolescents, especially as far as knowledge seeking and dissemination is concerned. What alternatives are they going to be resorting to?
I mean, you have other, like underground groups that they might go to. I mean, the biggest threat about social media is that it provides information that's unfiltered and uncurated. So the teenagers end up becoming susceptible to messages that their parents might not approve of.
All right, well, requested to stay on with us, Mr. Rossomando, as we have some news from Poland now to give to our viewers. Now, Poland is set to receive nearly $51 billion from the European Union's Safe Defense Program, aimed at strengthening its military capabilities. Prime Minister Donald Tusk has announced that the funds will support a range of defense initiatives, including the purchase of drones for the European Union's Eastern Shield, which safeguards the bloc's borders with Russia and Belarus. The provision will also fund space projects, AI development for defense, and military equipment. Additionally, Poland's Navy and border guards will benefit from the Safe Baltic program, enhancing security in the Baltic Sea. Tusk also mentioned the funds would be used for infrastructure projects like roads and railways directly to national security. Now, Poland, which is one of the top spenders on defense in NATO, has been a strong supporter of Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Let's bring back Mr. Rossomando into the discussion. Do you think this is going to help Ukraine now?
Well, I think that right now it's just no matter. I think it's probably going to be more helping Europe to defend against and deter any potential Russian aggression. I mean, right now, Poland's army has become the strongest in NATO in Europe after the United States. So I think this will send a message to Russia to stand back in terms of trying to invade NATO. I think that in terms of Ukraine, it won't have any impact whatsoever.
How do you see Poland using this amount that's going to be dispersed?
Well, I see it as working to further enhance its army, further able to enhance deterrence against Russia. I mean, right now, the Poles are building the most advanced army in NATO, and one that a few years ago stood no chance against the Russians, but now because we know of the limitations of the Russian war machine, that it can be a good deterrent.
All right, I thank you for now, Mr. Rossomando, for joining us here at NewsX World and giving your time to us. With that, viewers, let's move on to some news from Hong Kong. We're now learning that at least 13 people are dead and 15 injured after the massive fire engulfed several high-rise residential towers in Tai Po district. Thick grey smoke was pouring out from the burning buildings as firefighters battled the intense blaze. Authorities have said that several residents remained trapped and others suffered critical burn injuries. Now, some firefighters were also injured while trying to contain the flames ripping through the 31-story towers. Many children are covered in bamboo scaffolding. Dozens of fire engines and ambulances line the streets as crews use truck and other resources to contain the fire. Residents plead for government support as many people remain trapped inside. Let's listen in to the Deputy Director of Fire Services.
2:51, we received a report stating that there was a fire at Wang Chang House, and after 5 minutes, we arrived at scene. We also found that the fire was spreading to nearby buildings and spreading inside the buildings. So we immediately carried out our firefighting and rescue operation. Because the temperature in the fire scene is very high, so we decided to upgrade the fire to number 5 alarmed fire so that we can have more resources to deal with the situation.
That's all we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates from around the world.